Good evening. There are plenty more seats. If I could ask some of you who are sitting on the end to scoot in or to stand up and let some of your colleagues find their way to empty seats, that would be great. Thank you so much. And while you're moving around, maybe this is a good time to turn those cell phones off. A good time to make sure that you're not blowing up in the middle of what is sure to be an excellent lecture. In 1818, a daring young woman gave the world a nightmare. 200 years later, we remain haunted by Mary Shelley's visionary novel. And with 200 years retrospect, we can see that Frankenstein is far more than a novel. In fact, Shelley defined the archetypal myth of our modern era, shaping the stories we tell about science, about justice, and about the catastrophic power of prejudice to derail both. Tonight we celebrate Mary Shelley's accomplishment with Saladin Ahmed's Shadows of Frankenstein, a 200-year legacy. I'm Sean Berry, and I teach in the Department of English and Modern Languages here at Longwood University. It's my pleasure to welcome you. This evening's event is in 3 parts. First, Mr. Ahmed has some prepared remarks. Then he'll take questions from the audience. And finally, we invite you to join us for a dessert reception in the Haga room, which is just to the left as you exit the auditorium. On your way there, you might consider a detour to the bench in the foyer where the Longwood University bookstore is selling copies of both Black Bolt and Crescent Moon Kingdom. And by the way, Mr. Ahmed would be happy to sign autographs. I'd also like to invite you to join us in 2 weeks for Frankenstein Among the Scientists, a faculty roundtable featuring Longwood professors from chemistry, biology, computer science, and psychology discussing the legacies of the novel. That event is scheduled for March 12th at 6 p.m. in the Virginia room of the Moggins Alumni Center. This opportunity to celebrate the bicentenary of Shelley's masterpiece was made possible through the generous support of the Cook-Cole College of Arts and Sciences, the Presidential Lecture Series, the Cormier Honors College, the Program of Women's and Gender Studies, and the Department of English and Modern Languages. I'm indebted to the people who steer those ships: Dean Roger Byrne, Vice President Justin Pope, and Dean Alex Fink. In her capacity as Dean of the Honors College, Dr. Fink and her assistant, Ms. Dunn Miller, have supported this event, as well as a team-taught honors seminar this spring on the legacies of Frankenstein. Doctors Rhonda Brock-Servais, Shane Hetty, Dave McGill, Brett Martz, Chris McGee, John Miller, Kat Tracy, and I are very grateful to the Honors College for the chance to explore Shelley's novel and its influence with such a talented and thoughtful group of students. On a more personal note, I think that now for about 2 years, my colleague Dave McGill has encouraged and supported my desire to throw Frankenstein a birthday party. Thank you, Dave. Thanks also to Lisa Seamster, Administrative Assistant in English, for arranging the treats that await us at the reception. Finally, I want to thank Dr. Wade Edwards, Chair of the Department of English and Modern Languages. Wade exemplifies the best qualities a junior faculty member could hope to find in a chair: generosity of spirit and of intellect, and a passionate investment in the success of students and faculty. We're lucky to have him. Mary Shelley believed in the power of stories to foster a better world. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce you to a writer who shares her faith. Saladin Ahmed is the author of the Hugo-nominated Throne of the Crescent Moon, a fantasy inspired in equal measure by The 1001 Nights and the Arab Spring. Mr. Ahmed is also the writer of Marvel Comics' Black Bolt, a series that manages to make a silent, inhuman king a vehicle for investigating mass incarceration. This spring, he's got not one but two new comic series hitting shelves. In April, you'll find him exploring the outer reaches of the Marvel Universe with a quartet of time travelers in exiles, and with Abbott from Boom Studios, he returns to his native Detroit circa 1970 to tell the story of Elena Abbott, an African-American investigative journalist who takes on a murderous magical force. His short fiction and essays have been published by the New York Times, BuzzFeed, Slate, NPR.org, and too many others to list. Like Mary Shelley, Saladin Ahmed is a writer for whom the fantastic and the improbable represent tools for engaging urgent social issues. Whether he's conjuring an evil magus who uses fear spells to feed a monstrous man-jackal, or transporting us to a prison planet in the far reaches of space, Mr. Ahmed tells stories that extend sympathy to the strange and to the frightening. But he also tells stories that acknowledge monsters are real, and we create them with fear and hate. In that sense, I can think of no better speaker than Saladin Ahmed. Won't you please join me in welcoming him to the stage?
Sean, you left your phone here. Do a height adjustment here. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Is that better? Hello? Am I audible to the back? Okay. Awesome. I'm always intimidated when I get these very intense introductions because I feel like what I do up here is not possibly going to live up to that, but we shall try. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Hi. And thank you to Longwood for having me. Thank you to Sean, the department, and everybody involved for inviting me here. It's the first time I've been here. It's been an awesome experience. Had met with a couple classes earlier today that were wonderful to interact with, and staying in the old bed and breakfast up there, which is very atmospheric. So it's been a blast. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Frankenstein today, about somewhat about the novel, but also about Frankenstein as a sort of legacy, as our modern myth, as Professor Barry was putting it, and about its shadows over us, right? So the talks, there's some prepared stuff in here, but it's not scholarly or super formal, so forgive me if I make some sweeping generalizations here. And there's some quotes directly from the novel here, and I think you'll be able to tell by my voice and the language where those are coming in, right? And we'll begin with one of those. So from Frankenstein. Accursed creator, why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turn from me in disgust? God, in pity, made man beautiful and alluring after his own image, but my form is a filthy type of yours, more horrid even from the very resemblance. Satan had his companions, fellow devils to admire and encourage him, but I am solitary and abhorred. This is the lament of Frankenstein's creature, a noble soul who nonetheless feels so hideous and so miserably alone in the world that he wishes he'd never been made. I'm here to tell a sort of opposite story. A story not of Frankenstein's creature, but of Mary Shelley's creature, the novel Frankenstein, and how it's gone out into the world and made more friends than nearly any story in English. I'm here to talk about the power and the lasting legacy of one of the most important novels in our language, a work that I'd argue exerts a broader pop cultural influence than any single book besides the King James Bible. And I'm including Shakespeare in that. I mean, collected works, if you want to cheat, I guess, maybe more. But I'd like to start here by telling you a few stories. And you'll have to forgive me because I'm sort of toggling back and forth here. Our first story. A madman, secluded in a Gothic castle, throws a switch on a sinister-looking apparatus harnessing the power of lightning. "It's alive!" he howls, as his hunchback assistant says, "Yes, master!" Our next story. A naive young couple has car trouble and goes up the road to an old mansion for help. There, they are seduced into wild dancing, cross-dressing, and sex with an android. Earth's mightiest heroes are hunted by a mysterious enemy, a bloodthirsty robot that wants to destroy humankind. The worst part is, the monster is of their own making. A teenage girl, misunderstood and judged for her appearance, finds friends, including a vampire and a werewolf and a yeti, at a new high school where her differences are celebrated. Monster, we are monsters, yes we are. I have a small daughter. So what do all these stories have in common? All of them are part of the gargantuan, roiling mass of shadows cast by a single story written by a 19-year-old young woman 200 years ago. This is Mary Shelley, and I chose here a slightly debated sketch of her when she was young, because almost all the images you see of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, she's a very dour-looking older woman, which there's nothing wrong with, but I think I wanted to try and capture her closer to what she might have looked like when Frankenstein was written and celebrated. Right? So here is another quote from the novel. "The whole series of my life appeared to me as a dream. I sometimes doubted if indeed it were all true, for it never presented itself to my mind with the force of reality." Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was born in London in 1797, the daughter of the philosopher-writers William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. She lost her mother days after her birth, and although her father nurtured her brilliant mind, she was treated cruelly by her stepmother and was sent off to live with foster parents before eventually eloping with the married poet Percy Shelley when she was 17. Not long after this, at a famous glamping trip in the Alps, in response to the poet Lord Byron's challenge to pen a ghost story, she began to write Frankenstein. In 1818, the story, now a novel, rose from the slab and loped out into the world. Few other literary creatures have lived such a long and varied life. The novel's been studied extensively and has remained in print continuously for 200 years. I have to stop here as a professional writer and say how astonishing it is for a book to continuously be available on the shelves for 200 years. Like, if your book stays on the shelf for 2 years before it gets remaindered, right, at this point, you're like, okay, I did okay with my novel, right? 200 years. And she was a child almost, a young adult. It's been studied extensively, and it's a crucial entry not only into early horror, but damn near invented modern science fiction single-handedly. It took science fiction a long time, I think perhaps because Mary Shelley is a woman, to acknowledge Frankenstein as the first real science fiction novel in the modern sense, but it's pretty widely accepted as that now. So imagine creating a genre at that age, right? Amidst all the wreckage of the life that she was living, which was a hard one. So this isn't even getting into the question of Frankenstein as a book written by a woman, right? That survived in a male-dominated literary canon for as long as it has, and has had its struggles and sort of been rescued by feminist literary critics, re-rescued and re-rescued, right? As has to be done with women's writing and never has to be done with men's writing. But still has asserted itself to an astonishing degree in what's really an uphill battle for a woman's novel to be as important as Frankenstein is in the genres it's important in, right? It's not Pride and Prejudice. It's a very different book and faces a different kind of uphill battle in being remembered. But ultimately, Frankenstein's legacy is more than literary. Television, video games, its shadows are long and multicolored, extending across film, comic books, rock music, scientific debates. One such shadow extended across the ocean and across the centuries over Detroit, Michigan, where a young Arab-American kid was growing up among the rusted, smoke-spewing factories of Ford and Chrysler, which are sort of the ultimate demonic expression of the industrialization that sort of horrified the Romantics. That kid was me, wheezy, nerdy, small for my age, a sensitive kid in a tough neighborhood. Like Mary Shelley, I'd lost my mother when very young, had a father that was always putting books in front of me, and had a volatile relationship with my stepmother. And though our worlds couldn't have been farther apart, her monstrous child spoke to me. The companions of our childhood always possess a certain power over our minds, which hardly any later friend can obtain. Now, I think that I first encountered Frankenstein via toys. This is a Universal Monsters figure of Frankenstein from the 70s. And I owned, it was either this toy or one much like it. And I just knew Frankenstein was a monster. And he was really strong. And went, "Arr," right? Kind of, that's more of a pirate R, more like, "Arr," right? And cartoons. Oh, no, my cartoon is not here. Well, anyway, there's a cartoon when I was a kid, a really awful cartoon called Frankenstein Jr., which was just about this superhero Frankenstein. It was this really crappily animated cartoon from the 1970s. And I think those are the places where I first encountered Frankenstein. Now, when I say I first encountered Frankenstein, of course I don't mean the novel, right? And that's what I'm talking about here, is the kind of the way that these shadows extend beyond Shelley's written work. And I think maybe the best kind of testament to this that I can say, what's really telling, is that I don't know when I first encountered Frankenstein. I have these dim memories of toys and cartoons floating around in my 4-year-old consciousness, right? But as opposed to, say, Hamlet or Moby Dick, literary works that are supposedly ubiquitous, but that I can remember when and where I first encountered those literary works, right? As early as I can remember, I remember the pop culture basics of Frankenstein: mad scientist, misunderstood creature, right? The novel, or some bastardized pop version of its elements, have so deeply into our culture, in other words, that we take it in maybe before we can even read. I do know that I finally came to the novel itself in high school, reading it on my own, not in class, when I was supposed to be doing my math homework. I was the kind of student who was always reading, but not what I was supposed to be reading, and was rarely doing what I was supposed to be doing in school, but was learning nonetheless. And I first read Frankenstein in an edition stunningly illustrated by the comic book artist Bernie Wrightston. And it's probably hard for you to see all the intricate details of this image here. But Wrightston's a comic book artist, but very much takes his inspiration from kind of old engravings and just a remarkable level of detail. And this is from this lavishly illustrated edition that was produced in the 80s, and which really helped me come to the book. I don't think if I'd been alone with just this 19th century text that for me, this kid who read a lot but was really a kind of self-educated factory town kid, didn't know shit about 19th century language, right? I think I would have bumped up against the text too hard without illustrations helping, even in high school. And without, it's not as if I was being taught this in a class. I was just reading it on my own. And the illustrations helped me understand what was going on, not in only a kind of literal way, but helped me access the text. And so, again, I think this novel reaches out and lives beyond the text. It's a kind of always in paratext. And this was the first version I read. And the following year, I talked about it with my grandmother, who was a little old lady, elementary school teacher, who also happened to be a communist feminist. And she gave me a really lavish edition of it, which I intended to bring here, but unfortunately don't have with me. But I reread it. It's the first novel I'd reread, I think, that wasn't like a Dungeons and Dragons, kind of novel. And I had reread it a year later. And so many things in Shelley's work spoke to me that I think made me revisit it. There was this story of a creature that had not asked to be born, living in a world that didn't understand him. This felt very relevant in high school, right? There was this fascination with the power of technology, and yet this doubt with its limits that was kind of a part of my interest in science fiction in the first place, was this fear attached to it. And as I grew older, I began to see that these shadows, of course, weren't cast only over me, but that they had been cast over our entire kind of pop culture. I am alone and miserable. Only someone as ugly as I am could love me. The tropes and archetypes that spoke to me, the themes that the book forces you to meditate on, they've echoed across not only literature, as I say, but across forms and other media to become ubiquitous, with Frankenstein versions, sequels, knockoffs, references, spilling across hundreds of books and films and comic books and even songs. In the literary world, Frankenstein, like I say, is a foundational text. You can't really imagine modern science fiction or modern horror without it. And countless writers have paid tribute to Mary Shelley's work by doing their own version of sequel to, update to Frankenstein. But again, I think as much as we might talk about the literary legacy, I think it's beyond the page that Frankenstein's lived its fullest life, maybe. Of course, the famous, excuse me one second. I love audio visual. Well, I think we're missing another image, but I'm going to talk about the cinematic kind of legacy, right? Film really helped define Frankenstein, right? The Bride of Frankenstein kind of considered one of the really best films. Sean, do you think I could recruit you to try and get that to go full screen while I keep talking? And so I was supposed to be showing an image from Bride of Frankenstein here, but in any case, you guys know what she looks like, right? With the lightning streaks up the side of her hair. It's a famous horror film. It's kind of considered one of the, by some people, considered kind of one of the best American films of the early 20th century. And it's like all made up story that's only barely implied by the novel, right? And yet has kind of vaguely become canonical. If you ask what does Frankenstein's wife look like, people know, right? But it's not just sort of versions of Frankenstein, right? There's Abbott and Costello meets Frankenstein, which is a kind of comedy from the 1950s. There's Rocky Horror, which I'd shown earlier. There's sort of The Munsters, right, which is the like 1950s, 1960s TV sitcom with like a wacky dad, Frankenstein. So there's all these sort of actual literal versions of Frankenstein, but I think really the legacy of Frankenstein in film is in stuff that's not Frankenstein movies, right? So up here we have this bit from Jurassic Park, which basically became a meme, right? Where Jeff Goldblum's scientist figure says, "Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should," right? And the idea is the limits of science and how they bump up against sort of a human hubris, and a lot of people die because of that, right? Is like the plot of a lot of Hollywood movies, right? Terminator. The Terminator is essentially a Frankenstein's monster, right? Skynet, right? Really any film that you can think of that has to do with technology taking over or science run amok owes its DNA to Frankenstein. And I think if we just sat here for 5 minutes, we could probably come up with a whole bunch of movies that have that as their theme. Now, going beyond this, there's things like comic books, right? Again, Frankenstein himself appears as a character in plenty of comics, and there are versions of Frankenstein. The Frankenstein story, the story of Ultron, the evil cyborg that I showed in the Avengers poster earlier. But what's really interesting is recently there have been kind of versions or tributes or sequels to Frankenstein in comic books that have been popping up. So this is the cover for issue #1 of Destroyer by the horror writer Victor Laval. And it's a story about a woman, American woman, who is the last descendant of Victor Frankenstein, right? And her son is killed in a police shooting. And she, well, I won't give away too much, but essentially there is an unnatural life element to the story and violence, and it's this intense horror story that's a direct, not sequel to, but a direct inheritor of Frankenstein, and explicitly about the Frankenstein story in a direction that you never would have thought. You know, I can't picture Mary Shelley envisioning something like this, and yet I weirdly feel like she might have approved. So even across music, right? There's the Monster Mash in the 1950s, right? In which this guy sings an entire rock song pretending to be Dr. Frankenstein, basically, right? Or Boris Karloff, basically, but Dr. Frankenstein from the film. And there are like chain sound effects in the song and stuff. So you guys hear this song on the radio every Halloween, right? Like, how many 19th century novels inspired songs that you hear every year on the radio, right? It's kind of weird if you think about it. Frankenstein is a bit before you all's time, obviously, a bit before my time even. But Frankenstein by the Edgar Winter Group, right, is just a hard rock record that vaguely sounds, it's an instrumental record, there's no lyrics to it, but it weirdly sounds like Frankenstein, right? It's, again, it's hard to picture. I mean, I guess there are like Kate Bush things and things like that, but there are not a lot of 19th century novels inspiring, hard rock music, right? So I guess for me as a writer, it's this intense sense of awe when I see Shelley's legacy, when I see Frankenstein's legacy, this intense sense of jealousy, basically, right? In this age of ephemeral electronic texts and 2-minute news cycles and sort of buzz rising and falling swiftly, it's hard to kind of express how astonishing it is to see a writer that's lived, whose work has lived long enough and lived wide enough, if that makes sense, in our imagination, that we're still talking about it 200 years later. So I guess I'm going to wrap up here asking the question of why, right? Why has this book, or at least the characters and the ideas and the themes from this book, why has it occupied our imagination for so long and in so many different creative works? I think ultimately it's because of some of the warnings that Frankenstein gives us. It's an incredibly entertaining story with kind of like engaging main couple of characters, but I think that the reason that the themes and the devices from it resonate is because of the warnings they provide. And again, this is directly from the novel here. This is, again, from the Bernie Wrightston version, a kind of vision of Frankenstein's lab. It was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired to learn, and whether it was the outward substance of things or the inner spirit of nature and the mysterious soul of man that occupied me, still my inquiries were directed to the metaphysical, or in its highest sense, the physical secrets of the world. The story of Victor Frankenstein and his creature has helped generations of writers and filmmakers, musicians, and even scientists think about the limits and consequences of pursuing forbidden knowledge. Now, here is where I would sort of correct, I guess, or try to correct what I think is a common misreading. Some of Shelley's inheritors, right, the Skynet take on this, right, have mistaken her novel as a sort of cheap, knee-jerk warning against inquiring too deeply into the mysteries of nature, right? And there are some passages in Frankenstein that back that up. But I think at its core, Frankenstein's suspicions are better understood as suspicions, right? It's not that science is condemned. It's that there are questions to be asked, and there are suspicions to be had about the physical cost of institutional science, right? The radical responsibility that science has to have to the lives that it impacts. So it's less that Frankenstein is warning you against learning new things and more telling you, don't be a dick when you learn them, right? And think about who you might hurt as you learn them, right? And I think that's an important distinction versus the kind of cheap version of this that often gets circulated. Another warning here. Am I to be thought the only criminal, the monster asks, when all humankind sinned against me? For me, personally, just as a reader and kind of biographically as an Arab man, I think the most important thing to me is the idea of the monster as a hero. That's the most crucial warning, I think, or one of the most crucial warnings that Shelley provides us, is that those that we condemn to be monsters have the heroic in their nature just as surely as we do, right? And I think this again extends all across pop culture. Mutants, vampires are actually the good guys, you know? Like this kind of thing is very common. And I really do think a lot of it, we can look at Milton and his Satan, right? But I really think that it's really Shelley and her monster that give us this sense that this thing that looks horrific to you, this being that looks like a monster that you run away from because it looks like this scary monster that you've been told stories about, right, is actually thinking just like you are and feeling just like you are and is capable of at least as much nobility as you are and, oh, shit, maybe a little bit more, right? I think that there is that warning built into this story that for me, as a guy who's kind of seen his people maligned and hears a lot of monster stories told about his people, right, has always kind of spoken to me in a particular way. And I guess the last warning that I'd say Shelley offers us is the kind of flip side of that coin, right? Again, the creature says, "Listen to me, Frankenstein. You accuse me of murder, and yet you would, with a satisfied conscience, destroy your own creature. Oh, praise the eternal justice of man." And I think that despite my kind of personal preferences, I think maybe the most powerful universal warning that Frankenstein gives us is the flip side of the kind of hero as monster. And that's a reminder that you know, we're all monsters, right? As Professor Barry was saying at the beginning, that monsters are real, but they're not boogeymen or hobgoblins or whatever. They're us, right? And they're the messed up stuff that we do to each other. When Mary Shelley sat down to write a ghost story, she didn't find this terror in ghosts or vampires, and I would argue that she didn't even really find this terror in this hideous creature that she created, but that she found the source of horror in her human protagonist. we were talking at dinner about this common thing that know-it-alls like to do, right? When they say, somebody says, "Oh, Frankenstein's a scary monster," and the know-it-all in the room says, "Well, actually, Frankenstein is the name of the scientist," right? And I always kind of think the answer to that is no. Frankenstein is the name of the monster, right? Yes, he's the scientist and he's the monster, right? In the popular film versions, even, right? Frankenstein's creature is never as scary as like the villagers with the torches and the pitchforks, right? And I've seen people out there with torches. It's not a completely imaginary thing. A big pack of people doing that and calling people monsters and trying to go after people. So again, I think that this warning is maybe more topical than I would like it to be. Again, the idea that just humans are the scariest thing on the planet, right? So I'm going to end with a simple request here, and that's if you've never read the book, read it. And if if you're in Professor Barry and other folks' seminar, then that's awesome. You'll get an awesome guided reading, but don't feel like you need to read it with a teacher or in a class, and in fact, if you don't like reading books in class, I know it's a horrible thing to say at a college, it's okay. It would be better than you not reading it for you to take this book on your own and just sit with it, on some night when you feel like kind of thinking a lot and being creeped out a bit. Because we have this idea that quality literature sort of magically lasts, right? That it's like that because it's a work of great literature, something magical is going to keep it going, right? And that's not what happens. These stories get passed, these books get passed down from people, generation to generation, and that's what keeps them going. And a lot of capital G great, possibly life-changing works of art and literature have disappeared because they haven't been passed down. We're very lucky that Shelley's story has survived, flourished even in our cultural memory over the course of 200 years. And I guess if we're wise and we're lucky in study and in homage and in the minds of nerdy kids sitting alone with books, if we're lucky, maybe it will live another 200. Thanks. A little too much.
Going on in your head. But I'll get us started by asking a question. So one of the things that you seem to be saying about Frankenstein is that its cultural impact might actually be measured by the possibility of creative misreadings of it. That part of why we know that Frankenstein is important is because we have the Terminator version of Frankenstein. And I wonder if you would care to talk about the pleasure of misreading or the productive possibilities of misreading. Because on the one hand, it seems like you're encouraging us not to misread Shelley, and at the same time, you're telling us it's awesome that people do.
Yeah, I think I probably, that's a simple matter of me overstating that folks misread her. I certainly think the Terminator is in Frankenstein if you want to find it in there. I think, and this is a cheesy, evasive answer, but I think it's a hallmark of a really rich work that there's a lot of stuff in there, right? And some of the stuff even doesn't make sense up against some of the other stuff. And I think the book is both sort of like enamored of the kind of inquisitive spirit and doesn't see a problem with it in and of itself, and it's more about the ethical implications. And I think there's other moments where the book is just like, no, you're not supposed to know about that stuff. And so I don't know if it's so much a question of misreadings as, it's like the Bible or something like that. It's like, I don't mean in the sense that it's a sacred text, but I mean in the sense that you can get a lot of different readings out of it. And I think that unlike a lot of other texts which are just straight up misread, I think you can really lean pretty hard in a couple of different directions on a lot of different points with this book. And that's why I think a lot of different kinds of people should read it, you know? Mostly Marvel stuff. I had my few DC favorites, you know, and I read a few kind of like indie comics. This is in the 80s when they were first starting to do kind of comics outside of the big two that you could buy in the comic book store. So like when Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles first came out, it was a black and white, gritty, bloody comic book, believe it or not, about ninjas. And then it became a kid's cartoon, right? So I read some of that kind of stuff. But I was mostly a Marvel fanboy, pretty much. Yeah. That's really fascinating. Wow. I don't know Shelley. I know Frankenstein a lot better than I know Shelley, right? I know.
The question for everyone, the question was, I guess, what kind of science fiction would Mary Shelley like, given that she invents science fiction? Is that a fair way of characterizing
Right. Or disapprove of, which I find equally interesting. Yeah. I think that a lot of modern science fiction celebrates technology, even though they try and sprinkle in these warnings. Really, it's written by geeks who love tech and who are like, this is just the best, and really don't have a critical enough eye on the stuff that they're writing. And I think that Shelley would be she would have an issue with that. I also think, you know, modern science fiction, it's shifted a lot in the past few years, but it's still male dominated. It's still mostly dudes writing this stuff, mostly dudes making the decision about who gets published and all this stuff. And, you know, she was a feminist. She'd have beef with that, I think. There are writers out there that I think she'd love. There's a writer named Anne Leckie who writes novels about sentient spaceships that like have weird gender politics and stuff like that, and they're just like awesome, and I think like that kind of stuff would really float Shelley's boat. I do, yeah. I mean, I'm kind of constantly working on my second novel, and that will be another few years before that's out, but I'm always working on comics. Issue number 2 of Abbott, I feel like I'm doing commercials up here. Issue number 2 of my indie comic, Abbott, which is, as Sean said, this kind of crime horror comic starring a black woman journalist in Detroit in the 1970s. The first issue sold out, yay me! And the second issue is coming out this week. So, and then I've got other things I'm doing for Marvel. I'm writing Exile starting in April. I'm writing a Quicksilver series. Also, no, that's starting in May. And then there's always secret projects, right? So, and you never know which one of the secret projects is going to become a real project, right? It's like, so you just say on Twitter, I have a secret project, and then when it becomes something real, you can announce it. So, but there are other things in the work that I hope will be announced soon. That's very sweet of you to say, and it's really strictly because I wrote a novel beforehand, you know, so I got a lot of practice. I was a poet before that, and so I probably think a lot more about sentence level writing, choosing words more carefully rather than just getting across a story point, what the words sound like, things like that, than maybe some comics writers do. So I'm appreciative that you noticed. Thanks. Yeah, you know, I was speaking at a creative writing class earlier today, and somebody asked a pretty similar question about world building. And my response is always don't do too much of it. I think that those of us who are kind of fantasy and science fiction geeks, we love to create a world, right? And when we get into a new work and we get a new fandom or whatever, it's often the world that we're attracted to, right? And it's immersive. But the problem is that when you're writing, you can get too hypnotized by that. I created a whole language, and I know what the coins look like, and I know the 3,000-year history of this country. And I'm like, well, okay, but what does your main character want? I don't, and you don't ever want to create that kind of story. You always want to have these characters at the core of the story who have identifiable kind of wants and needs that you can relate to in some sense. You like some of them, you don't like some of them are funny, some of them are annoying. You need people at the center. And that world building always has to happen around those people. So I would always say, do your research, enjoy that stuff, but don't let it take the place of really writing a novel, or really telling the story that you want to tell, because the story is still the core thing. The world is the place that the story takes place in, right? Mm-hmm. No, I think it's only a bonus. I think I think when you see things that have to have an official version, I think that inevitably there's some quality control involved with that, right? So you're not going to have just, Van Helsing or whatever, right? But Van Helsing was fun. It was stupid, but it was fun, right? And so I wouldn't want to lose that. There was like a Street Fighter video game called Night Stalkers when I was a kid that was like different monsters fighting each other, right? It's like if there were a Shelley estate mandating this stuff, that would never have happened, And I think we're better off for having, you can always sort through the crap and find the really great stuff. And if people are free to do, it's a trip, because James Bond is, still in the Fleming estate in the States. In the UK, you can't write a James Bond story unless, you can write one, but you can't publish one. You certainly can't make a James Bond film unless you have the approval of the Fleming estate. In Canada, James Bond has lapsed into the public domain. So now film's a different story, but people can write James Bond stories, right? So they did this anthology that was all these Canadian writers doing these crazy takes on James Bond that were like, and it wasn't just like a super spy, it was James Bond 007, kind of like exploring all sorts of things. That it was just a great anthology. And I really think that after a certain time, I'm a writer. I want to make a living off my stuff. I would like my kids to make some kind of living off my stuff after I die. It's about all I got to leave them. But after that, I think we need to let these stories out into the wild, because I think you do tap into something bigger than yourself. I think Mary Shelley's brilliant. She was a genius, bona fide, but she was at a certain time and place. She tapped into something, and I think the responsibilities of our stories extend to the fact that we tap into something bigger than us, and we owe something bigger than ourselves with those stories, I guess. It's a schmaltzy answer, but... Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it was hard. I cheated a little bit. I'm cheating now. There are points in the story where he, gets his powers taken away, and so he can talk. There are points in the story where he has a little psychic sidekick who can kind of articulate what he's trying to say. So without some kind of crutches, when Jack Kirby and Stan Lee had him, he had Medusa speaking for him. So he's always had some kind of crutch. There's always been some sort of storytelling crutch in terms of telling a story, but yeah, it's a different thing than just writing straight up dialogue. You lean on captions a little bit more. I will say that that's a place where you really become aware how much of a collaboration it is with the artist, because Christian, I can have Black Bolt not say anything. Somebody says something to him, and we just get a reaction, and Christian draws his face, and it's all about the facial expression. The artist is half the team of the comic book, and if Christian gives the guy the right facial response, right, he doesn't have to say anything. We just see in his eyes how he's responding to the words that were said to him. So it's a challenge, but I think it's a heck of a lot easier in a place like a comic book than in prose would be. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dracula was published in the 1890s, I believe. I think, yeah. So it's a good deal afterward. But the first kind of popular vampire story, actually, if I remember correctly, actually emerges from the same trip as Frankenstein. The same kind of like, we're roughing it in the Alps, in a nice little cozy. I call it glamping to be snotty, but from that trip. It was Byron, right? Polidori, right? Yeah, and it's this little bit of a vampire story that then Stoker pretty probably read before he wrote Dracula. So there is this common thread, and it's all kind of through the Gothic that they were all interested in. But there's something different that happens with monsters in particular that Frankenstein's often kind of talked about in relation to the Gothic novel, but I think. I don't know. I think something different happens when you focus on a monster and not architecture and atmosphere and stuff. And it's like this single hideous figure. But that's, that's amateur stuff now. I'm sure Sean thinks I'm an idiot. But yeah, I think there's some common lineage there, and I think that there's a reason vampires too got rehabilitated, right? That people wanted to ask, well. How's the vampire feeling about this, right? Dracula does not care about that, the novel Dracula. It does not, we get stuff from his point of view, but really he's a bad guy. He needs to be stopped. But it's not too long after that we start to kind of explore the question of, well, maybe there's something more there too. I think the question of the monster with a soul is, whatever the monster is interesting to people, and for some of the reasons I tried to lay out. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's the modern Prometheus is of course the subtitle of the book, right? But I really do think there's the golem stories, there are various stories from various traditions of sort of inanimate creatures becoming animate, but the question of true sentience, there's little mythic things here and there that sort of resonate with that. But I really do think she made something pretty new with what she was doing. She was bouncing off of some of these older things, but I think the articulateness that she gives the creature is so different that it becomes a kind of difference of kind, actually. Oh gosh, I think of like just weird random stuff that only academics know. What's that? Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Well, not even necessarily related to Frankenstein, but just talking about how this is a phenomenon that we lose works, and it's not necessarily that I'm thinking of any specific work. It's just more that it's not that rare a thing to have written something brilliant. We're kind of taught that it never happens, right? But lots of people have really great ideas. Lots of people end up writing them down, and lots of them just, I see it happen with friends of mine, let alone in an age where there was not a kind of electronic retention of everything, and if you threw something in the fireplace, it was just gone, right? Or if, you tried to get it published and the publisher threw it in the fireplace and it's just gone, Things are impermanent. Things disappear, and I was being semi-dramatic, but my point was just we think of the canon as this thing that just sustains itself, right? And because these works are so great, they will last. And it's not greatness that makes things last. It's getting passed around, and the reason things get passed around is not just because they're great. There are other reasons. They speak to people in certain ways, and I guess I'm just up here making an argument that folks who have not given a chance to the book, especially if some of these themes that have come up in other stuff that you've watched or listened to or whatever, give it a chance is really the argument I'm making, I guess, and try and read the book, and that's how the canon keeps going, is people caring, not being forced to this is a great book, bam, but like, oh, I love this. I'm going to someday read this to my kids, right? Oh, yeah. It was his mom, right? That brought. So Confederacy of Dents is a really hilarious, weird book, and the author was intensely depressive, I guess, right? And sort of and committed suicide eventually. And it was his mom, his dear mom, who brought it, just like some lady from New Orleans, I guess, was it? And brought it to New York publishers, and somebody, happened to actually. Oh, was it? Yeah, happened to actually. Give it a chance, but that kind of thing doesn't happen so much anymore. Nowadays they call security on you. You show up with your manuscript at my publisher's door, they'll be like, you need a card to get on the elevator, sir. Mm-hmm. Probably, yeah. I mean, I'm sure my image of the creature is but even that was like the way the creature's depicted in Wrightston's illustrations is different than he looks in the 1930s movie with the big bolts in the neck kind of thing, right? But yeah, the book's from the 80s, so it's Wrightston was definitely a guy who grew up watching those movies and stuff, and then did his own spin on it. But it's interesting that the creature itself. I was getting into a discussion. I'm a Twitter fanatic. I was getting into a discussion with a friend of mine on Twitter about, what is this thing made out of? Is it made out of dead bodies? And it's really hard to tell in the text. Like, we're told he goes to slaughterhouses and things like that, but the exact question of what this thing is supposed to look like, there's a lot of possible interpretations of the text. And so you've seen movie versions influence each other, right? And illustrations where somebody's basically drawing the creature from the 1931 film, or versions where it tries to look more like dead bodies stitched together, like Robert De Niro's version of Frankenstein, or Kenneth Branagh's film where Robert De Niro plays the monster, and he's just this like dead body stitched together thing, looks like a Resident Evil zombie, right? It really depends on the intentions, I think, of the interpreter, and I think places where they've tried to emphasize the noble nature of the creature, he tends to look more like just a really big, handsome guy who's got some weird, slight deformities. And versions where he's more of a bestial thing, he looks more like a monster. A really interesting thing that I was reading in the New Yorker just like maybe a week or so ago, there was an article about this in the New Yorker, talking about how a lot of stage adaptations, the very first stage adaptation was like the 1820s, only a few years after the novel, and he had blue paint to indicate that he was the monster. So, and there's questions about kind of racial coding, some versions where the monster is like kind of dressed like a Native American and stuff like that. So it's a weird and varied history how people have depicted it. I don't know. I think, and that's the thing, it's this synthesis, right? It's like, it's a brilliant novel. And I don't think that pop culture, if it had just been a kind of like some good ideas, but like really not good writing and not good storytelling specifically, right? I mean, Shelley's not the best writer ever at the sentence level, right? There are better writers in the 19th century, but the way she tells a story, as distinct from kind of the prose itself, right? Plotting, right? Characterization and things like that. I think it was essential to people continuing to tell this story, even if they told it in like a bastardized form, right? It's like if you hear a cool story and then, you see a cool movie and then you tell your friend about the plot of the movie because the story itself is so compelling, right? And I think it was that kind of thing that had she not had those chops, I don't think we'd be telling these stories still, probably. Yes, because everything is. I mean, I don't. Writing is going to reflect, and when I say writing, the publishing industry specifically, because writing's not discriminatory. You sit with a notebook, do whatever you want, right? But if you want it to get out to people, That's publishing, and that's, yes, it's part of the world. You know, we live in a world where there are a lot of built-in discriminatory kind of attitudes still, even people with their best intentions trying to change that. It takes a long time to turn a ship that big, right? And so is it harder to make it as a woman writer? Yes. Is it harder to make it as a writer of color? Yes, it is. I mean, just straight up. I won't, you know, there are opportunities that will be open to you because of those things, but do they counteract the kind of just everyday weight of all this other stuff? No. And is writing like some magical place where because people are cool and writers and artists and they're going to be like open-minded and not racist? No. Sadly. Is it any more racist than the rest of the world? No. You know, in my experience, it's about the same. You know, every place you go, there's going to be some idiots, some bigots, some assholes. You know, there's going to be some decent people trying to make it better. You hang out with them, avoid the rest. And but I wish I had a happier answer for you. I think so, but I think not in a direct homage kind of way. But you know, as I say, I'm really interested in monsters being good guys, and there's a comic book thing that I'm pitching right now that I can't talk about because I don't know if it'll actually get approved. But there's something there's a character I'm hoping they're gonna let me write that is a kind of monster guy, and if it works out, I'll be very happy. So, but. Thus far, it's been mostly just, like I say, the kind of big ideas from Shelley. This idea of being afraid of people, right? And what we do to each other, and looking twice at monsters and seeing what might be not so monstrous there, and having concerns about where our knowledge comes from and how it's made and stuff like that. Those are kind of the thematic elements. Although, you know, I've got my little plot ideas here and there that might, you know, any writer that is actually making a living at it has about 1,000 different ideas floating around that they can pluck if necessary, right? And so some of those involve some plot elements, but we'll see if they ever come to light.
We have a round of applause for
Oh gosh. Thank you guys so much.